Marshall was a political economist teacher at the University of Cambridge and wrote the book The Principles of Economics. In this book, he emphasized the idea of the price and output of a good done through supply and demand. This changed economics. Economists would try to better understand the price of a certain good by looking at what might shift the supply and demand curve. In order to better understand supply and demand, you first must understand the basics. Law of supply. The rule that, holding everything else constant, increases in price cause increases in quantity supplied, and decreases in price causes decreases in quantity supplied. This causes the supply curve to be upward sloping. Through this, you will see movements in the supply curve. Law of demand. The rule that, holding everything else constant, when the price of a product falls, the quantity demanded of a product will increase. And when the price of a product rises, the quantity demanded of a product will decrease. This causes the demand curve to be downward sloping. Through this, you will see movements in the demand curve. Shifts in supply and demand. Shifts in supply. Price of inputs, technological change, price of substitutes in production, numbers of firms in the market, and expected future price. Shifts in demand. Income, price of related goods, taste and preferences, population, and expected future price. Now that we know the basics, we will better understand other ideas in micro and macroeconomics, such as the impact of taxes, price and floor ceilings, shortages and surplus, aggregate supply and demand, money supply and demand, monetary and fiscal policy, and so on. Now let's look at an example. Who would hand out business cards door to door for me for $3 an hour? For $5 an hour? Yeah. One person? For $8 an hour? 2 people? And for $10 an hour? 3 people would work for me for $10 an hour. Before we draw a graph of supply and demand, first we will look at the supply and demand schedule. Let's look at the supply side. The supply is the people willing to work. At $3, 0 people are willing to work. $5, 1 person is willing to work. $8, 2 people. $10, 3 people. Now let's look at the demand schedule. The demand schedule is the firm's willingness to pay. So, at the price of $3, the firm is willing to pay 4 people to work. At $5, 3 people. $8, 2 people. $10, 1 person. As we can see, the equilibrium would be $8 for 2 people to work. So now let's look at supply and demand in graph form. As we see, the supply is sloping upwards because of the law of supply, and the demand is sloping downwards because of the law of demand. So at $3, 0 people are willing to work, but the firm would demand about 4 people. At $5, 1 person would be willing to work, but the firm would demand 3 people. At $10, the firm is willing to pay 1 person to work, but 3 people would be willing to work. Now let's look at the equilibrium point. At $8 an hour, 2 people are willing to work, and that is where supply and demand cross. That would be our equilibrium point. Now let's look at a macroeconomic example. Market of loanable funds. This market is the money market. It is where companies go to borrow the money for investment and where consumers go to put their savings away. The equilibrium in this market depends on the supply of money and the demand of money. Where they equal will be the equilibrium rate of interest.
This is the market for loanable funds, which is an example of supply and demand in macroeconomics. For there to be a shift in demand, it has to be an outside factor. An outside factor which could shift demand would be a technological change. When a technological change occurs, firms are willing to invest more, so it will shift the demand of loanable funds. When the demand shifts, the quantity of loanable funds will increase to LF2, and the interest rate will also increase.
So now we're going to look at the supply side of the market of loanable funds. For example, if the government runs a deficit, that would cause the supply of loanable funds to shift to the left. Causing supply of loanable funds to decrease. and interest rate increase.
Now we're going to see if the government were to run a surplus, the supply will shift to the right. The loanable funds would actually increase and the interest rate would decrease.
Why is supply and demand important? Supply and demand are important in macroeconomics because without supply and demand, people cannot bargain for labor, money, or services.